The notification came at 2:47 in the morning. Claire Beaumont had been awake already. She usually was at that hour, sitting at the kitchen island with a cold cup of coffee and a spreadsheet open on her laptop that she wasn't really reading. After Harrison died, sleep had become something that happened to other people. She'd learned to stop fighting it. The security alert was just a soft ping on her phone. Motion detected. South Garden. Camera 4. She almost ignored it. Raccoons had been getting into the compost again, and the system didn't know the difference between a masked bandit and an actual threat. But something made her pick up the phone. Maybe it was the hour. Maybe it was the particular silence of the house, the kind that pressed against the walls. She tapped the notification. The footage was grainy in the way that night vision cameras always are, everything tinted gray-green and slightly unreal. But what she saw made her sit up slowly, her coffee forgotten, her spreadsheet forgotten, everything forgotten. Her daughter was in the garden. Juniper, her 7-year-old daughter who hadn't spoken a word in 14 months, who flinched at loud noises and ate her meals looking at the floor, who the 3 different specialists they'd seen called severely withdrawn in voices that were careful and kind and ultimately useless. Juniper was crouched in the grass near the old birch tree, and she was laughing. Not giggling, not the polite, reflexive sound children make when adults expect them to. She was laughing the way she used to laugh before the accident, the kind that came from the stomach that took over the whole body. And she was not alone. The man sitting cross-legged in the grass across from her was Declan Marsh. The groundskeeper Claire had hired 8 weeks ago through the property management company. She had met him exactly once, briefly, when she'd signed the service agreement in the driveway. He'd been quiet, practical looking. He'd shaken her hand and said he'd keep out of her way. He was holding his hands up toward the motion sensor light on the garden wall, and the shadows his fingers cast on the pale bark of the birch tree were moving. An animal. A bird, maybe. Then something with long ears. Then something that turned its head. Juniper reached forward and touched the shadow on the tree, and the sound that came out of her, the laugh, the real one, the one Claire had not heard since the night they buried Harrison, went straight through the phone speaker and straight through Claire's chest like a current. She stood up so fast she knocked over her coffee. She didn't go outside. She watched the footage until Declan glanced toward the house, then gently said something to Juniper, Claire couldn't hear what, and stood up. Juniper followed him to the back door of the kitchen, which Claire had apparently left unlocked, and Declan held it open. Juniper went in. He didn't follow. He went back to the small utility cottage at the edge of the property where he apparently stayed on the nights he worked late. Claire met Juniper at the kitchen doorway. Her daughter looked up at her with an expression that was still half lit with something warm, something almost shy, and then the shutters came down again. Not completely, but mostly, and she just looked at the floor. Claire knelt down in front of her. Were you in the garden, Bug? Juniper didn't answer. She never answered, but she didn't move away either, and Claire put her arms around her, and her daughter, very quietly, almost without deciding to, leaned in. Claire held her for a long time in the kitchen doorway with the night air still on Juniper's hair, smelling like grass in September and something she couldn't name. She didn't sleep at all that night. She sat in the dark and tried to understand what she'd seen. Declan Marsh had come with a 1-page resume and 2 references, both of which checked out. He was 38. He'd worked grounds and property maintenance for a decade. Before that, the resume just said medical field, various roles, without elaboration, which Claire had found mildly odd at the time but hadn't pressed. The property management company had vetted him. She had more urgent things to think about. What she knew practically, he was reliable. He showed up when he said he would. The garden, which had been neglected since before Harrison's accident, had started to look tended again, not manicured, not the way it looked when they had the full landscaping crew, but cared for, like someone was paying attention. She'd noticed in passing that he sometimes stayed past his contracted hours without mentioning it on his timesheet. She'd noticed that he'd replaced the rotted board on the back fence without being asked. She'd noticed that Juniper, who went rigid and silent around most adults, had started going to the kitchen window sometimes in the mornings when his truck was in the driveway. She had not noticed, until that night, that he'd ever been anywhere near her daughter. The next morning she called the property management company before 7 a.m. and asked for everything they had on him. Claire Beaumont was the kind of woman who knew how to find out things. She had spent 15 years building Meridian Capital into one of the most respected mid-market investment firms in Ontario, and she had learned early that the most important information was almost never in the documents people gave you voluntarily. It was in the gaps. The gap in Declan Marsh's resume turned out to be significant. Before property maintenance, before the decade of quiet, practical work, he had been a physician, pediatric emergency medicine. He'd trained at McGill, done his residency at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, and then for 7 years had worked at a hospital in Thunder Bay that served, among other catchment areas, a stretch of highway that ran through some of the most isolated country in northern Ontario. He had lost his license 4 years ago. Claire found this out through a contact at the College of Physicians and Surgeons who owed her a favor. The details were not in any public database, but when she pressed, she got a name and a date, and a case number. The case number led her through a series of calls and requests and one very long evening with public court documents to a night in February 4 years ago on a highway north of Lake Superior where a transport truck had jackknifed in a whiteout and set off a chain of collisions that left 11 vehicles involved and the highway closed for 16 hours. Declan had been driving home from a weekend shift. He'd stopped. He'd pulled people from 2 vehicles before the paramedics arrived. One of those vehicles was a sedan that had slid off the shoulder and was beginning to smoke. He'd broken the window and pulled the driver out. The driver had survived. The smoke became a fire while Declan was still at the car, and his hands, his surgeon's hands, had been burned badly enough that when the plastic surgeon was done, the fine motor precision that pediatric surgery required was gone. He had not recovered it. He'd tried, apparently, for over a year. The hospital had been sympathetic. The college had been, in its own procedural way, sympathetic. But medicine is an unforgiving field for hands that shake at the wrong moment, and eventually the license lapsed, and then it was formally surrendered. Claire sat with this information for a long time. Then she looked at the case number again, looked at the date, looked at the name of the second vehicle, the one before the sedan, the one he'd reached first. Her hands went cold. The driver of that vehicle had been Harrison Beaumont. She pulled the accident report herself. She read it 3 times. Her husband had been driving back from a client dinner in Sault Ste. Marie, a dinner she'd been supposed to attend and had canceled at the last minute because of a board meeting that had run until 9 p.m. She had spent 14 months thinking, in the specific corrosive way that grief has of rewiring reason, that if she had been in that car with him, something would have been different. It was not logical. She knew it wasn't logical. It didn't matter. What the accident report told her was this. Harrison's vehicle had come to rest against a concrete barrier. He had been alive when Declan reached him. Declan had kept him alive, pressure on a chest wound, manual airway management, done without any equipment in a February whiteout for 22 minutes, until the paramedics arrived. Harrison had died in the trauma bay in Thunder Bay 4 hours later from injuries the surgeon who operated said had been unsurvivable from the moment of impact. He had not died because help was slow. He had died because the accident was unsurvivable. The paramedics had said so, the surgeon had said so, the report said so. And a man whose name Claire had not known until 8 weeks ago had knelt in the snow in a blizzard and refused to let her husband die alone. She pushed back from her desk and put her face in her hands. She didn't know how to approach him. She was not generally a woman who didn't know how to approach things. She had negotiated 9-figure acquisitions. She had fired people she respected and hired people she didn't trust yet. She had sat across from regulators and institutional investors, and once, memorably, a journalist who had a story she'd needed to kill, and she had always known what she was doing. She didn't know what to do with this. She watched the security footage again that evening, watched the shadows on the birch tree, watched Juniper's face, the way the light caught it, the way she reached forward to touch something that wasn't really there. Juniper had been in the car that night. She'd been in the back seat, asleep. She'd been uninjured, physically, a miracle the paramedics had called it, and they'd meant it as comfort, and it had landed nowhere near comfort. She hadn't spoken since she was interviewed by a family services worker 3 days after the accident, and then the silence had just extended, and the specialists had said words like trauma response and selective mutism and give it time, and time had given them nothing except more of itself. What Juniper knew or remembered or felt about that night, No one could say. She was 7. She didn't have the language for it even when she had language. But she knew Declan's shadow animals. And she had laughed. Claire went to the cottage the next morning. It was just past 7, and the light was low and golden, and her breath made small clouds in the October air. She knocked. He answered in a work shirt with paint on the cuff, holding a travel mug of coffee. He looked at her the way people look when they're deciding quickly what kind of conversation this is going to be. Mrs. Beaumont. Sims, she said automatically. Then I'm sorry, I wanted to. I saw the footage from last night, Juniper in the garden. Something moved across his face, not guilt, something more careful than guilt. I apologize, he said. I should have. No, she stopped. That's not what I'm here about. She looked at him for a moment. The burned skin on his left hand was visible below the cuff of his shirt. She hadn't noticed it before. She had not been looking. I know who you are, she said. I know what happened on that highway. I know what you did. He was very still. I've known for 2 days, she said, and I have no idea what to say to you, which is not something that happens to me very often, so I thought I'd just say that. The silence between them was the kind that has weight to it. You should probably come in, he said finally. The coffee's terrible, but there's enough. His daughter's name was Wren. She was 5. She lived with him full-time. Her mother had left when Wren was 18 months old, before the accident, before the rest of it. He didn't say this with bitterness. He said it the way people say facts that have long since stopped having edges. Wren was in the local school. He'd moved to this part of Ontario when he'd taken the job, which was the same thing he'd done for 4 years. Gone where the work was, kept a schedule that let him be home when his daughter needed him, tried not to need too much room. She's the reason I stopped pushing on the license, he said. He was looking at his hands around the mug. There was a window, I think, where I might have been able to, if I'd done the program right, the retraining. But it was 18 months of intensive, and I would have had to. I couldn't have taken Wren through that. I wasn't willing to. Do you miss it? Claire asked. He didn't answer immediately. She watched him decide whether to answer honestly, and she watched honesty win. Every day, he said, but not the way I used to. She asked about the shadow animals. He looked briefly surprised that she'd asked about that specifically, and then not surprised. Wren went through a phase when she was 3 where she was scared of the dark, he said. I figured out that if I could give her something in the dark to focus on, something she could control sort of by telling me what to make, it was less frightening. He paused. I have no idea how Juniper knew to look for it. She started coming to the window of the cottage about 3 weeks ago. Just watching. I didn't approach her. I just let her watch. And then one night last week, she was in the garden when I was walking back from the equipment shed, and I just started doing it, without really deciding to. She sat down in the grass. He set his mug down. I should have told you. Yes, Claire said, you should have. She looked at him. But I understand why you didn't. She did not tell him that morning that Harrison had been one of the people on that highway. She wasn't ready for that conversation, and she needed to think about whether it was hers to give him or whether it was only more weight to put on someone who was already carrying plenty. What she did instead was go back inside and call Dr. Anuja Patel, who was Juniper's current therapist and who had been, over the past 14 months, the most useful of the various professionals they'd seen. Which was to say she was honest about what she didn't know, and she listened more than she talked. She laughed, Claire said, in the garden, at 2 in the morning with the groundskeeper looking at shadow animals on a tree. A pause on the line. What kind of laugh? A real one. Another pause. Tell me about him. Claire told her. Not everything, not the highway, not yet, but enough. The way Juniper watched for him. The way she'd followed him to the back door. The way she'd leaned in when Claire had held her that night, just slightly, just enough. Children who have experienced shock trauma often respond to indirect engagement, Dr. Patel said. Something low pressure, no expectation of response, no direct eye contact even sometimes, a pause. He's not trying to fix her. No, Claire said, he's not. That might be exactly why it's working. October turned into November, and the garden went dormant, and Declan started coming 3 times a week to deal with the winterizing. The beds needed covering, the irrigation lines needed draining, there was a section of fence that had to be properly braced before the snow. He stayed later than he needed to. He always had. Claire told him about Harrison on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week of November. She waited until Juniper was at her afternoon session with Dr. Patel. She waited until there was enough time. Then she found Declan by the back fence with a post-hole digger, and she said his name, and when he looked up, she said, "I need to tell you something, and I want you to know that I've been trying to find the right way to say this for a month, and I'm not sure there is one." She watched him while she spoke. She'd learned, in 15 years of business, to watch people's faces when they got information they weren't expecting. You learn things that way that you couldn't learn any other way. What she saw on Declan's face was not what she'd expected. It wasn't shock, exactly. It was something older than shock, the look of a person receiving information that rearranges everything they thought they understood about their own story. "I didn't know," he said when she was done. His voice was very quiet. "I never knew his name. They don't give you that after," I asked once. They said the family hadn't consented to contact. He looked at the fence post in his hand, then set it down against the fence. She was in the car, in the back seat, asleep. He put a hand over his mouth briefly, then lowered it. "I didn't know there was a child. I didn't look in the back." He said this like it was something he'd been carrying, the question of what else he might have missed, and Claire shook her head. "She was fine," she said. "The paramedics said she was completely uninjured. You didn't miss anything." "I know," he said. "I know that. It's still," he stopped. "I know," she said. They stood in the cold for a moment with the empty garden around them. "I should have told you months ago," she said. "I wasn't sure if it would. I didn't want it to change things. For Juniper." "It doesn't change anything," he said immediately. Then, more slowly, "Does it change things for you?" She thought about that, about the 14 months, about the accident report, about Harrison's hands on the steering wheel of a car she hadn't been in, on a highway she'd never driven, in a blizzard she'd only ever heard described. "It means I can stop wondering if anyone was there with him," she said. "So no, it doesn't change things. It closes something." He nodded slowly. He looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told, for the first time, that they are allowed to put it down. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me." Juniper spoke for the first time in 15 months on a Tuesday morning in December. It was not dramatic. It did not happen the way Claire had sometimes imagined it, in a moment of crisis or catharsis or some culminating scene from a film. It happened in the kitchen. Declan was there because Claire had asked him to fix a section of the mudroom floor that had been lifting for weeks, and he'd brought Wren with him because her school was closed for a professional development day, and Wren had apparently decided that Juniper was her friend without consulting anyone, and the two of them were sitting at the kitchen table with a box of markers that Wren had found in Juniper's school bag. Claire was on a call in the next room, the door half open, half listening. Wren said, "What color should I make the fox?" And Juniper said, "Orange." That was it. One word. The ordinary color of an ordinary animal. Claire stopped mid-sentence. Her colleague on the call said, "Claire, you still there?" And she said, "I'll call you back." And she stepped to the doorway and looked at her daughter, who was looking at the marker in Wren's hand with an expression of calm interest, as if she hadn't said anything remarkable at all. Declan was crouched over the mudroom floor. He'd gone very still, the way he'd gone still when Claire had told him about Harrison on the highway, but he didn't look up. He kept his eyes on what he was doing. He did not make it into a moment. Claire stepped back from the doorway. She leaned against the hallway wall and put her hand over her mouth and cried, very quietly, for about 90 seconds, in the way that people cry when they've been waiting for something for so long that the arrival of it is almost more than they can hold. Then she wiped her face and went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on. She restructured her firm in the spring. This was a business story, not a personal one. There were regulatory changes coming that she'd seen 3 months ahead of everyone else, and she moved Meridian Capital before the rest of the market understood what was happening. The restructure cost her 2 senior partners who didn't agree with her direction, and it cost her a large institutional client who followed them, and it was still the right call, and she knew it was the right call before she made it, and it was still lonely. Declan came for dinner on the Friday after the restructure closed. This had become a thing that happened. Not every week, not on a schedule, but with the ease of something that doesn't need a schedule. Wren and Juniper did their homework at the kitchen table while Declan made the kind of practical, unfussy food that Claire, who was an excellent executive and a mediocre cook, had never learned to make. He'd brought the ingredients himself. He always seemed to know when she needed to not be in charge of something. "How are you?" he said, meaning the week. "Tired," she said. "Right, both." Wren asked Juniper if she wanted to watch something after dinner, and Juniper said yes, and the two of them disappeared upstairs with the tablet, and the sound of them arguing cheerfully about what to watch drifted down through the kitchen ceiling like ordinary noise, like noise a house should have. Declan poured her a glass of wine and set it on the counter beside her without comment. "I've been thinking," he said, "about applying for reinstatement." She looked at him. He was concentrating on the cutting board. The program they run is 2 years, but part of it can be done while working. There's a hospital in Hamilton that has a partnership, supervised practice, phased return. It's not emergency pediatrics. It's not, he stopped, but it's medicine. And I think Wren is old enough now. I think we can do it. "I think you can do it," Claire said. He looked up. "I think you've been treating yourself like someone who gave something up when what actually happened is that something was taken from you. And those aren't the same." She held his gaze. "You kept my husband alive for 22 minutes in a blizzard. You sat in a garden in the middle of the night making fox shadows on a tree until my daughter laughed for the first time in over a year. You are not someone who left medicine." She reached for the wine glass. "You are someone who has been waiting to go back." He was quiet for a long time. "I filed the preliminary paperwork last week," he admitted. She smiled. "I know." He gave her a look. "I'm an investment manager," she said. "I know how to read people who've already decided. I've been watching you decide for 2 months." He shook his head, but he was smiling too, and the kitchen was warm, and upstairs the sound of their daughters arguing about something completely inconsequential floated down through the ceiling. And Claire took a sip of wine and thought that this particular combination of light and noise and the smell of something decent on the stove was not a thing she had expected to have again. She had not expected a great many things about the past 4 months. She had not expected that what grief left behind, if you gave it enough time and enough space, was not emptiness. It was room. Room for a man with careful hands and a quiet daughter and a story that had, it turned out, been tangled up with her own story long before either of them knew it. Room for the ordinary sound of children upstairs choosing a show. Room for wine on a Friday night in a kitchen that no longer felt like a room you endured. Room, even, for the faint improbable possibility that they were not at the beginning of a thing but in the middle of one, that it had started on a February highway in a blizzard, without witnesses, without either of them knowing what it was. Wren appeared at the top of the stairs and shouted, "Juniper says it's your turn to choose, and she already gave me 3 options, and I want the one about the penguins, but she said that's hers." "Then you choose something else," Declan called up. "But I want the penguins." Wren. "Fine." The sound of small feet retreating. Juniper's voice, very clearly, "You always do this," and then unmistakably, Wren's laughter and Juniper's underneath it. Declan and Claire looked at each other across the kitchen. Neither of them said anything. Some things don't need saying. I keep coming back to that garden. 2:47 in the morning, a 7-year-old in the grass, and a man making fox shadows on a birch tree. And somehow, in that completely ordinary moment, something that had been locked for 14 months just opened. I don't think that happens by accident. I think it happens because of who Declan was, underneath everything that had been taken from him. He lost his career because he stopped on a highway to help strangers. He spent 4 years in a kind of quiet exile, doing work that was far below what he was capable of, and he never once made himself into a victim of it. That's not nothing. That's actually one of the hardest things a person can do, to keep showing up with integrity when the situation you're in is genuinely unfair. Most of us, if we're honest, would have been bitter. We would have let people know we were bitter. Declan just kept fixing the fence boards. Nobody asked him to fix and staying past his hours and making shadow animals for a child who couldn't tell him whether it helped. That's what I mean when I think about character. Not character as a concept, but character as a daily choice made when nobody's watching and there's no reward for it. Claire saw it on a security camera at 2 a.m. She saw it because it was real, not because he performed it for her. And Claire, She had to do something difficult too, which was sit with information that complicated everything. She found out that the man winterizing her garden had held her husband alive in a blizzard for 22 minutes and lost the work of his hands because of it. She could have done nothing with that. She could have told herself it wasn't her responsibility to carry. A lot of people would have. Instead, she chose truth over comfort, even when truth required her to feel things she hadn't finished grieving yet. The reason Juniper said orange on that Tuesday morning in December wasn't magic. It was the slow accumulation of everything that came before it. A man who didn't push, a mother who didn't give up, a 5-year-old who just decided they were friends, a kitchen that gradually became a place where nothing was required of anyone except to be there. Healing doesn't usually arrive as a revelation. It arrives the way winter does, not in a single storm but in the slow shortening of days, until one morning you look up and the light is different. What stays with me is that Declan filed the reinstatement paperwork before Claire told him he should. He'd already decided. He just needed, I think, to say it out loud to someone who would understand what it cost. That's what it means to keep going. Not the grand gesture, not the dramatic turnaround, but the quiet decision to try again, even when trying again is genuinely hard and the outcome isn't guaranteed. Some things don't need saying, but some things do, and the courage to say them, to tell the truth, to ask for what you need, to choose the harder right thing over the easier silence. That's what moves a story forward. It moved this one.